Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Well, hi, everyone. Today, my guest is Dr. Julie Alig, CEO and founder of JLA Analytics. And today, we're going to be talking about the power of data and how to use it to grow your business. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure.
So, the first question I always ask every guest, tell me your story. How did you get to be the data diva?
It was definitely not a straight path. Basically, I tell people I'm a refugee from higher education. I got my doctorate. Halfway through my dissertation, I realized I did not want to be a professor, but I feel very passionately about higher education and about its transformative potential in a person's life. So I went to work in higher ed, but on the administration side. So I put my quantitative skills, my data science skills that I had just built up during my program, and I put them to work figuring out forecasting, figuring out enrollment, figuring out student success and barriers to student success, doing student engagement surveys, all this kind of fun stuff that data geeks like me like. And several years ago, I just started realizing that the kinds of questions I was being able to answer for my clients within the university and the university system, I wanted to be able to touch not just that, but I wanted to be able to bring those more broadly to businesses. And so I basically said, peace out to higher education. And I went out on my own, founded my business, and now I work with a few higher ed clients from 20 years in higher ed doing predictive analysis and things like that, but mostly with businesses and nonprofit organizations.
So what's the kind of data that you collect and analyze for these businesses?
Yeah. So basically, a lot of any kind of data, a lot of times what it is for many of my clients, it's the same data, more or less, that their accountant or their CFO looks at. But instead of creating a profit and loss sheet, I use different tools on that same data, and I'm able to say something different than what the CFO or the accountant might be able to say. I'm able to talk about not just what's going on, but why it's going on. So I do forecasts. With some customers, they're interested in the customer journey and customer retention. And so I'm able to use their CRM data, sometimes merge that in with their financial data. Other clients are in the HR space, and they want me to take a look at employee engagement surveys. They want me to look at employee retention. They want me to look at different kinds of pay incentives, that sort of thing. So it's really, Steve, it's really any kind of data that the business wants me to look at, I can look at it.
Interesting. So yeah, I get the power of, in particular, the financial data.
Mm-hmm.
So many businesses drive down the road looking in their rearview mirror financially, right? Because your P&L is always telling you what happened, not what's gonna happen. right? And the power of a cash flow forecast, the power of, what is, what do we project as revenue? What do we need to do to make it so that we stay cash flow positive, for example? If we're going to make some kind of big investment, what's the best way to do that? Whole bunch of things like that. Those kinds of financial analysis, really, really powerful for a business owner.
And then marry that together with not just forecasting out your cash flow over the next 2 quarters or 3 quarters or something, but then being able to layer on top of that, or integrate that in some sort of analysis of what your customer base is going to look like over the next 2 or 3 quarters. Maybe you're a business that has a very seasonal aspect to it. Maybe you're losing customers. And so, being able to put those together really gives my clients a lot more focus on exactly what's working, what's not working, and what's realistic looking forward.
Yeah, that a number of things going through my head here as you're talking.
Yeah.
The power of understanding customer churn.
Yes.
That's a critical KPI for
Yes.
it's one of the things that controls the health of your business. And I
Mhm.
think you're right. Most small business owners haven't a clue what that looks like.
Or
Want to
even
talk
middle market. Even
Yeah.
middle market business owners don't. I know. And then it's one thing to know the churn. It's one thing to know how many you're losing, but then it's another thing to figure out which ones are you losing? Why are you losing them? And then what do we do to get them back?
So talk a little bit, tell us a story or two about what you've done there to help small business or even mid-sized businesses
Mhm.
to get a handle on that, the customer retention or, customer churn and so forth.
Mhm. Sure. So one of my earliest clients was a professional services business. And in this case, it was an outsourced HR business. And what they were trying to figure out, and this was just coming out of COVID, right? And all of those lockdowns. So they didn't have a good sense of how their customer base was going to be, had been impacted, and what they could do going forward to either keep them. They weren't quite sure which of their products or services were the ones that they could count on, to have that kind of almost staircase of customer relationships. So I was able to go in, take a look at historical data, certainly. But how are you going to use historical data to project out after something like a global pandemic, right?
Which is
So
something that happens
exactly.
every century or two, right?
Yeah, total force majeure there. Yeah, but what you are able to do is look at the patterns of how the different types of customers have acted in the past. And you can look at the patterns of what the likelihood is that this kind of customer would be interested in this kind of offer. And so doing that kind of mapping, and Steve, what you and I would think of, I think more as like modeling, something like that, I was able to help them understand which of their offers might have been just awesome ones to get that customer relationship going previously, but it just wasn't. It wasn't going to fit the market, the customer in post-COVID. And so I helped them strategize which of their other offers we could somehow use to replace that.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that I have as, somebody who knows something about numbers and how to deal with, spreadsheets and looking and analyzing data and patterns and things like that is that most small business owners, they're afraid of numbers. They're afraid of looking
Yeah.
at data.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the psychology of that and how you help your clients sort of overcome that fear.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's not insignificant. A recent study has shown that 93% of Americans, adult Americans, have some sort of math anxiety. So, this is yeah,
Yeah, doesn't
exactly.
surprise me at all.
Exactly, but that's pretty much so basically most of the clients that I have some level of that. So, the way that I try to allay those fears or those knee-jerk kind of defensive reactions is by focusing on what the outcomes are and focusing on, yeah, I know this is something that to you might not ever consider this to be your favorite thing to do, but if you want to hit that next plateau in your business, if you want to make sure that you're growing your profit and not just revenue, right? Which sometimes can kind of be kind of a vanity metric. Not always, but sometimes it can lead you astray. And so, focusing on the outcomes, sharing some of the outcomes that I've had with previous clients or other businesses or case studies or something from others that do, something kind of similar can show, listen, there's all this that's just waiting to get unpacked in your business. And it doesn't need to be rocket science. I wasn't sure if I could say that with you, Steve, but it doesn't.
I say that all the time. The stuff that I work on, it's not rocket science. And by
Yeah.
the way, I can do rocket science, and
And it's not rocket
this
science.
is
I
not
know.
rocket
Yeah,
science. Yeah, exactly.
exactly. People hear that I'm a data scientist. I do machine learning, I'm getting deep into generative AI and everything. And they think that, everything I say is going to be just absolutely just on another plane of existence. And it's really not. When you boil things down, just like I tell my students and I tell my private clients, we boil things down, we're trying to figure out what things are associated with other things. How likely is it that they're random or not? And how much confidence can we have in trying to say anything about those relationships going into the future? And so I really try to put it into much simpler terms, and I use a lot of pictures. I try to use a lot of charts and graphs to help communicate what's going on. That seems to be a good communication tool, I'm finding.
Yeah. Because and I think that's because we're many of us are visual creatures, and when you see a chart,
Yep.
it doesn't matter whether it's this decimal point or that decimal point. It doesn't matter the number of significant figures. You can see the trend, you can see the correlation, you can see this one's going up the same amount, or this one's going the other direction. There's anti-correlation, right? It's easier to see that in a picture than it is from looking at numbers on a spreadsheet. And even too many numbers on a spreadsheet, my eyes glaze over. So being able to pull that out and make a picture often distills that
Yeah.
information at a glance.
I am right there with you. Too many numbers on a spreadsheet, and like I uh, like I say, the cognitive load on my brain is quite heavy. And so whatever I can do to minimize that cognitive load, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to figure out, what we're trying to see is if there are any trends, any patterns. And what's the best way to see, at least my brain and a lot of other people's brains, the best way to see a pattern? Actually looking at something.
Is a picture. That's right.
There you go.
I think I want to touch on something else too, and it goes along with this. Very often business owners don't pay attention to some of the critical pieces of information that really are in control of the health of their business.
Yeah.
And ignoring it if you just because you don't pay attention to it doesn't mean it doesn't have any influence.
Mhm.
And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What are the pieces of data that you find small business owners don't pay enough attention to in general? And what recommendations would you have for the listeners in
Mhm.
terms of what they really should analyze that perhaps they're not?
Yep.
We've already talked about revenue and profit. So, but
Yep. My first answer always is, if you don't know your profit, that should be your first one. Really your first KPI, because it's very easy to calculate what the revenue is. But once you start digging down a little bit to get the profit, then you've got the costs in there, and it starts having a bit of a better picture. Um, I always go back to customers. So anything dealing with my customers or their customers, I counsel that those are the ones you absolutely need to be paying close attention to, because we all do different things in our businesses, but we all trade services or products for money to customers. If you don't have your customers, you don't have a business. And so customer retention, understanding your customers, and that can be different kinds of customers, different behaviors, and understanding customer feedback also. A lot of business owners aren't thinking about the fact that they can get customer feedback, not just from, rate this on a scale of 1 to 5, but by having some open ended questions and then being able to analyze those. And I think using generative AI has just opened that up just tremendously. It makes it so much easier for anyone to go in and just tell it, here is a document with a whole lot of customer feedback. What are the 5 top positive things you hear in this? And what are the 5 least positive things? And that's one of the best use cases for generative AI right now. And I think that's a very light lift for a small business owner, even medium, mid-market, and certainly for entrepreneurs.
that's a great idea, is to take advantage of those kinds of tools that are out there, relatively inexpensive, and just feed it raw data and say,
Yeah.
what are the trends? What can you tell me about this? Now, you obviously have to be careful, um, but
Yes.
so
I,
let's talk a little bit about that. I know you're an expert in the generative AI space, the data scientist. Let's talk a little bit about.
the generative AI. Yeah. I I counsel people just in general. Um AI can do a whole lot. AI cannot do statistical analysis right now. It can't. And I was actually in a webinar that a colleague of mine was giving a couple of weeks ago, and she's very heavy into marketing and digital marketing and incorporating a lot of generative AI. She's one of those people who's like really at the forefront of what the changes are and how those are, what they mean for businesses, especially in the marketing space. And she started talking about how and her partner had taken a whole lot of sales data, fed it into GPT 4.0, and told it to analyze it and give her the trends. And my heart just stopped, because you you cannot trust at this point, at least from what I've seen, it can't go out and do that kind of analysis and come back with something that is reliably accurate. I've yet to see it. When I mentioned it to her, I told her I'd like to follow up and I wanted to. So when we followed up later, she said, really? But it's running Python in the background. And for people who aren't familiar, Python is a coding language that is one of them you would use to run these more statistical analyses. And I said, well, you're absolutely right. It's running Python in the background, but it's not interpreting it. And it's not saying whether or not the results, it's not doing like the diagnostics on it. It's not double checking itself. So, as far as that, with generative AI, I would not at this point. I would not trust it. I'm curious if you've had similar findings.
Yeah, so I've not tried to do any statistical analysis. I mean, I think the thing that I warn people around generative AI is that it will sound absolutely authoritative,
Yes.
even when it is absolutely wrong,
Yes.
because it's not a thinking machine, it's a predictive engine. And what it is doing is predicting the next word. What's the most likely next word in the sequence? Which is a great deal different than knowing and expressing an idea. Because ChatGPT doesn't have ideas.
Yep.
It just creates sequences of words.
Yep. And it predicts what is the next most likely. You absolutely, you got it.
Yeah.
I run a kind of a simulation of this with my students. I teach some business analytics to students, and first class, because of course now everyone is using Gen AI to do things like write papers or things. And so we have a quick little exercise where we ask the generative AI, explain this concept if we're studying market basket analysis or something. And it'll come back with something, and I'll say, okay, the floor is open. Is it right or not? And it most likely isn't. A lot of times it isn't. And so we try it again, and it's still not. And so the point is, you can do this if you want and turn in anything generated from generative AI, but you're rolling the dice, my friend.
Yeah, you have to know something. Somebody described
Yep.
to me ChatGPT as the world's most patient assistant.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That
Mhm.
it, you give it a very specific task, it will go off and do it,
Mhm.
but you better have enough knowledge in the area to know whether or not what it came back to you with is accurate. And you can go off and say, gee, this isn't quite right. I need you to do this a little bit differently. And you can do that 100 times and it will never complain.
Yep.
But you have to be the final arbiter of whether or not it is correct.
Exactly. I describe it as treat it like a summer intern. They have some knowledge, not as much as you. They want to please you. They don't want to be wrong. And so they always sound very self-assured and all and confident, which is great,
Yeah.
but they don't want to seem stupid. And they don't want to seem like they're wrong.
Never going to say, I don't know.
Exactly. So I
And
guess that's what our listeners
and the
do.
other piece of it, of course, is that unlike a summer intern, you could ask it to do the same task over and over and over and over again. It would never get bored and it would never complain. So,
Yep.
so there
You got it.
is that. So,
Yeah.
Julie, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way to reach me is over on LinkedIn, or on my website, www.JLA all one word, .com. And, speaking of generative AI, I've got a little something. If anyone is interested, I have a quick video of a couple of ways that businesses can integrate generative AI into their day to day, into some of their business processes or flows or something. It's a quick video. You get to watch me do it on screen and you can follow along. But hopefully, that's the sort of thing that um, that will help those business owners who might be a little intimidated by it, really just give it a try.
That's great. Thanks. And that concludes our show. Thanks so much to my guest, Dr. Julie Alig, the CEO of and founder of JLA Analytics. I hope you learned something about the power of data. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.